When the new borders were drawn in August 1947, a sudden, blind panic swept across the subcontinent. Religious communities that had lived together for centuries were suddenly untethered. 16 million Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims were displaced overnight, creating a surge of movement that no one was prepared to manage. With roads clogged and dangerous, the sprawling railway network became the only logical artery for those trying to reach the other side of the line. Refugees poured into every available space, piling into open livestock wagons and onto the roofs of passenger cars. They boarded these trains under the assumption that the state infrastructure would offer them a path to safety. But the reality was a collapse of local authority. Security forces vanished, and in many districts, law and order ceased to exist on the platforms. The tracks that once served the internal logic of a unified empire now funneled millions of people toward a dark destination, where the newly formed state could no longer guarantee their survival. On the tracks, passengers were completely exposed. Wooden carriage walls and open cars offered no protection against armed mobs that could intercept a train anywhere. On September 22, 1947, an armed Sikh mob intercepted a train carrying Muslim refugees at Amritsar. For 3 hours, the attackers used swords and rifles to systematically kill 3,000 people. The train's official escorts reportedly stood by, deliberately missing the attackers to let the slaughter continue. 2 days later, a reciprocal attack occurred at Kamoke. A Muslim mob killed 400 refugees and abducted 600 women from the carriages. This level of targeted violence forced the government of Pakistan to halt all refugee convoys, effectively cutting off the only transit route for millions. Beyond the violence in the passenger cars, the railway was suffering an internal collapse. The institution was losing the very people required to keep it running. Skilled Muslim drivers fled to Pakistan, while Hindu and Sikh administrative staff fled to India. The workforce was splitting along the same religious lines as the new borders. In some vital Indian railway divisions, the operational staff plummeted by 60%. It was a logistical paradox. The railway system lost more than half of its skilled labor at the exact moment it faced the highest demand in its history. To keep the tracks from going silent, railway executives turned to extreme, rapid-fire measures to fill the labor gaps. Promotions were fast-tracked through one-day interviews. Overnight, 700 basic train cleaners became firemen, responsible for the heavy, dangerous technical work of maintaining steam locomotives. But the staff who remained were struggling to find food as national supply chains broke down. The railways were forced to open 600 grain shops, increasing daily rations to 16 ounces. They had to ensure their workers had enough calories to physically shovel coal and keep the network moving. The railway was no longer just a transit service. It had become its own self-sustaining state, operating in a permanent state of emergency. The physical division of the tracks trends the political partition into an economic one. India absorbed 7 regional systems, but the Northwestern and Bengal Assam railways were split by new national boundaries. This severed historic trade routes. Pakistani cotton was blocked from Kanpur's mills. Eastward, the jute trade collapsed, stranding the raw materials powering the regional economy. The inability to move goods through the old rail corridors helped drive both newborn nations into an immediate economic depression. It took immense physical grit from the remaining railway workers to move millions of refugees and slowly rebuild a fractured infrastructure. But that logistical effort is forever tied to the memory of the blood trains, which remained the primary symbol of the violence that accompanied the birth of these nations. The iron network built to integrate the subcontinent became the primary tool used to pull it apart.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most defining and honestly most turbulent moments in modern history, the 1947 partition of India. But look, we're not just going to rehash the broad political strokes here. We're going to examine this massive historical earthquake through a totally different lens, the subcontinent's most vital piece of infrastructure, its railways. You see, the railway system was the pulsing heart of the region, and during partition, it became the stage for both unimaginable human tragedy and just incredible institutional resilience. So, let's get right into it. 16 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the number of Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims who were abruptly driven out of their homes in 1947. This wasn't just some simple border dispute. right? The creation of the independent nations of India and Pakistan sparked literally the largest migration in human history. We're talking 16 million lives uprooted almost overnight, desperately seeking safety across newly drawn borders. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. First, the Great Migration. Second, the train massacres. Third, a crippled railway system. And finally, the economic fallout. Section 1. The Great Migration, Transfer of Populations. So, when the former British Indian Empire was partitioned to create the new Muslim homeland of Pakistan alongside India, both nations immediately slammed into an unexpected, totally chaotic transfer of populations. Like we mentioned, it became the largest movement of peoples in human history. Now, prior to independence and the split, India's religious communities were deeply, deeply intertwined. I mean, they lived side by side for generations. It was widely accepted that, sure, some people might shift across the new borders, but a complete mass evacuation that seemed completely impossible to the officials at the time. Nobody saw this coming. But the reality on the ground was far, far different. Listen to this observation from photojournalist Margaret Burke-White. Spindly but determined old Sikh, carrying ailing wife, sets out on the dangerous journey to India's border. That quote really captures the profound human element here, doesn't it? The sheer, absolute desperation of these refugees. Driven by reciprocal pogroms and intense communal violence, families literally had no choice but to grab whatever they could physically carry and flee toward the borders. They instantly became this tragic modern phenomenon, stateless migrants. Section 2. The Train Massacres, Violence on Railways. Because millions of people needed to cross these borders as fast as possible, the railways naturally became the primary means of escape. But tragically, they also became the sites of unimaginable violence. We can see a rapid, terrifying escalation over just a single week in September of 1947. On September 22nd, a major massacre occurred in Amritsar. Just 2 days later, on September 24th, another massacre happened in Kamoke. The violence escalated so quickly and so viciously that by the end of September, the government of Pakistan entirely stopped all refugee trains traveling between the Indian Punjab and the Pakistani Punjab. To really grasp the reciprocal nature of this tragedy, we have to look at these events impartially. Consider the events in Amritsar in East Punjab, where armed Sikh Jathas swept through a train, viciously attacking Muslim refugees with rifles, swords, and spears. Then compare that to the Kamoke massacre in West Punjab. There, a train carrying Hindu and Sikh refugees was halted, and a large mob of Muslims attacked the train from the back. It was an identical display of horror, perpetrated by different groups, but resulting in the exact same human devastation. The human cost was just staggering. At Amritsar, roughly 3,000 people were killed and 1,000 injured, leaving only about 100 passengers unharmed. At Kamoke, government reports detail around 400 killed, with over 600 women and girls abducted. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is understanding how the infrastructure itself failed the people. The wooden railway carriages of the era provided absolutely zero physical protection from the armed mobs outside. Once a train was stopped, the passengers were entirely trapped and entirely defenseless. Section 3. A crippled railway system. We're going to pivot now from the staggering tragedy of the passengers to the massive institutional crisis happening inside the railway system itself. Because, the violence and displacement didn't just affect the riders, it completely fractured the workforce trying to keep those trains moving. A staggering 126,000 non-Muslim workers opted to migrate to India, while 83,000 Muslim workers migrated to Pakistan. This massive cross-border shuffle created a severe operational nightmare. The staff who migrated to Pakistan included a huge concentration of drivers, foremen, and workshop technicians. Because of this, India suddenly faced critical shortages, up to 45% in some areas, of the very people they desperately needed to operate the heavy machinery and load the coal. So, to survive this operational nightmare, Indian Railways had to implement some pretty drastic measures just to keep things functioning. They expanded recruitment, set up intensive training programs, recalled retired staff, and radically relaxed their criteria for promotions. To give you an idea of just how desperate the situation actually was, 700 train cleaners were instantly promoted to the critical role of firemen after just a one-day interview process. And that process, it was basically just a quick literacy and medical check. That's it. On top of the severe staffing shortages, the railways also had to battle starvation. Shortly after independence, food prices completely surged. To sustain the incredibly heavy manual labor required to run the railways, and honestly, to simply stave off hunger, the daily grain rations provided by the railway grain shops for workers were officially increased from 12 ounces to 16 ounces in 1948. This was a stark institutional recognition that the trains literally could not run on empty stomachs. And the administrative chaos behind the scenes was just as deep. Because these railway workers fled their homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs, they arrived without any of their professional service records or pension contributions. By 1948, a full year after partition, 14,000 refugee workers were still waiting to establish their pension records. Can you imagine? Colleagues had to rebuild these workers' entire professional histories based purely on trust and sworn affidavits. It was an absolute administrative nightmare. Section 4. The economic fallout. Macroeconomic fracturing. If we zoom out from the railways for a second, we can see that this fracturing perfectly mirrored the broader macroeconomic reality of these two newly partitioned nations. India absorbed roughly 82% of the undivided country's population, but only received 77% of the land area. Conversely, Pakistan received 23% of the land area for only 18% of the population. And this brilliantly illustrates the core of the problem. This highly uneven distribution meant that India was instantly burdened with a disproportionately high population density. It left millions completely homeless and strained the economy from day one. This loss of land cascaded through the entire economy. India lost 22 million acres of highly fertile, irrigated land to Pakistan, which resulted in a net loss of 7 to 8 lakh tons in its annual food supply. But this agricultural loss directly starved the industrial sector as well. The textile and jute industries were absolutely devastated. For instance, jute shipments arriving at Calcutta's railway stations dropped drastically from 10 million to 6.4 million mons. Because of this, India, which was previously a major exporter of raw cotton and jute, was suddenly forced to become an importer. This sudden shift just wreaked havoc on its balance of payments. Further complicating the economic recovery was a massive debt. Prior to partition, an agreement dictated that Pakistan would inherit a 300 crore rupee debt to India as liabilities, which was supposed to be paid in installments. But this debt was never repaid, nor was the interest. This put incredible strain on India's public finances, ultimately forcing the Indian government to try and recover the value by acquiring assets located in Pakistan. The 1947 partition wasn't just a shifting of lines on a map. It was an earthquake that shattered the physical, economic, and human infrastructure of the subcontinent. Which leaves us with a final question to consider. How do the echoes of these massive infrastructural and economic fractures, like the slow death of the Eastern jute industry or the sudden displacement of millions of workers, still shape the realities of India and Pakistan today? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that builds our present.